The morning of March 20th, 1943, at the Plaszow Concentration Camp on the outskirts of Krakow, Poland, a 28-year-old woman stood before a grand piano in the commandant's villa. Her name was Natalia Karp. She had not bathed in weeks. Her prison uniform hung loose on a frame that had lost nearly 30 pounds since her arrival at the camp. Her fingers, which had once commanded standing ovations in Berlin's most prestigious concert halls, now trembled from malnutrition and fear. Across from her sat Hauptsturmführer Amon Göth, commandant of Plaszow. He was known throughout the camp for shooting prisoners from his balcony with a high-powered rifle as morning sport. The inmates called him the Butcher of Plaszow. He had ordered Natalia and her sister Helena brought to his quarters because someone had told him there were trained musicians among the Jewish prisoners. He wanted to hear Chopin. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The piano was a Bechstein grand, probably looted from a Jewish home in Krakow. It was well maintained, recently tuned, absurdly elegant in a camp where thousands died from disease, starvation, and random execution. Göth sat in an upholstered chair with a glass of cognac. His Tyrolean hat rested on a side table. His service pistol lay within easy reach. Natalia understood the situation with perfect clarity. This was not a concert. This was an audition for her life and her sister's life. If Göth was pleased, they might live another day, another week, perhaps until the war ended if they were impossibly fortunate. If he was displeased, if her playing was inadequate, or if he simply felt caprice overtake him, they would be shot. Perhaps immediately, perhaps that evening. The mechanism of their death was less important than its certainty. She had not touched a piano in nearly 4 years. The last time had been in the spring of 1939 in her family's apartment in Krakow, before the world collapsed. Her hands had been strong then, her fingers certain, her mind clear. Now she was starving, exhausted, and terrified in the particular way that comes from living for months under the constant threat of arbitrary execution. Göth gestured toward the piano. He said nothing. He did not need to. The power dynamic was absolute. Natalia sat at the bench. She adjusted her posture from memory, from years of training that had begun when she was 4 years old in this same city. Her fingers found the keys. The ivory was cool, smooth, familiar, in a way that made her want to weep. She closed her eyes for just a moment. Then she began to play Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor. The notes filled the room. The left hand established the steady, melancholic rhythm. The right hand began the melody, each phrase shaped with the kind of interpretive nuance that comes only from profound understanding of the composer's intent. She played as she had been trained to play, with technical precision and emotional depth, though now the emotion was not artistic interpretation, but raw terror transmuted through muscle memory into something that resembled art. Göth listened. He did not move. He sipped his cognac. His face revealed nothing. The Nocturne lasted approximately 5 minutes. When Natalia played the final notes and lifted her hands from the keys, the silence in the room was absolute. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear her sister's breathing behind her. She could hear Göth's breathing. She waited. What happened next would determine whether music, which she had believed her entire life to be humanity's highest achievement, could save her from a man who represented humanity's deepest descent into barbarism. Natalia Weissman was born in Krakow on February 27, 1911, into a city that was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Her family was Jewish, middle class, and deeply cultured. Krakow before the First World War was a city where Jewish, Polish, and German culture intermingled in the cafes, concert halls, and universities. The Weissman family lived in an apartment near the Old Town, close enough to hear the Hedgenow trumpet call from St. Mary's Basilica every hour. Natalia began playing piano by ear at approximately age 4, using an instrument that had been left by previous tenants during the First World War. She demonstrated exceptional aptitude immediately. She could play with both hands, improvise harmonies, and incorporate whistling, singing, and even percussion with a tambourine while she played. Her parents recognized her gift and arranged for formal training with a local teacher who understood they had encountered a prodigy. By age 9, around 1920, Natalia gave her first public concert in Krakow. The performance established her reputation as a gifted child pianist. Her technical proficiency was remarkable, but what impressed audiences and teachers more was her musical sensitivity. She did not simply play notes correctly. She understood phrasing, dynamics, the emotional architecture of the compositions she performed. At 13, she resolved to pursue piano professionally, prioritizing music above all other studies. Her advanced training came under the brother-in-law of Arthur Rubinstein, one of the most celebrated pianists of the era. This connection placed Natalia within Poland's most prestigious musical circles. She refined her technique through grueling daily practice, typically 6 to 8 hours at the piano, working through exercises, etudes, and full compositions. Her repertoire expanded to include the major piano works of Mozart, Beethoven, Schumann, Liszt, and particularly Chopin, whose music was considered the apex of Polish cultural achievement. In the early 1930s, Natalia traveled to Berlin to perform. The city was then the cultural capital of Europe, a place where modernism in music, art, and literature flourished despite growing political tensions. At approximately age 20, she performed Chopin's Piano Concerto No. 1 in E minor alongside the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. The concert took place in one of Berlin's major halls before an audience of German music enthusiasts who prided themselves on their sophisticated taste. The performance was a triumph. German newspapers praised the young Polish virtuoso. Critics noted her technical command and her particular affinity for Chopin, calling her interpretation both powerful and sensitive. This success positioned Natalia as a rising talent in European classical music, a Chopin specialist with the potential for an international career. She returned to Poland shortly afterward because her mother had fallen ill, curtailing immediate opportunities for additional European tours. But the Berlin performance remained the pinnacle of her pre-war achievement. It represented validation from the most demanding musical audience in Europe. It proved that her years of training, her dedication, her sacrifice of normal adolescent experiences for endless hours at the keyboard had been worthwhile. She was not merely a talented local musician. She was a concert pianist capable of performing on the world's greatest stages. In Krakow during the mid-1930s, Natalia continued performing and teaching. She married another pianist, though specific details of this marriage remain less documented than her musical career. She maintained connections with other Jewish musicians and artists in the city. Krakow's Jewish community numbered approximately 60,000 people, roughly a quarter of the city's total population. They were doctors, lawyers, merchants, artists, teachers. They were integrated into the city's economic and cultural life while maintaining their religious and cultural identity. Natalia believed in the power of music as a transcendent force. This was not naive romanticism, but a conviction born from experience. She had seen how music could move audiences to tears, could communicate emotions beyond the capacity of language, could create temporary but genuine communion between performer and listener, regardless of their backgrounds. She had experienced the profound satisfaction of technical mastery, of interpreting a composer's intentions, of feeling her fingers execute complex passages with precision and grace. Music was not merely her profession. It was her identity, her purpose, her understanding of what made life meaningful. When she sat at a piano, she entered a state where the material world receded, and only the music mattered. This was the belief system she carried with her when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. The German Wehrmacht entered Krakow on September 6th, 1939, without significant resistance. Poland's military forces were overwhelmed by the speed and power of the German assault. Within weeks, the Polish government had collapsed. The country was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, according to the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Krakow became part of the general government, a German-administered territory that would serve as a dumping ground for populations the Reich considered undesirable. For Krakow's Jewish population, the occupation brought immediate restrictions. Within months, Jewish businesses were marked and confiscated. Jewish professionals were barred from practicing their occupations. Jews were required to wear white armbands with a blue Star of David for identification. Public spaces became forbidden. Parks, theaters, concert halls, all closed to Jews. For Natalia, this meant the end of public performance. No more concerts, no more students. The piano in her family's apartment became her only connection to her former life. In March 1941, the Germans established a ghetto in the Podgorza district of Krakow. Approximately 15,000 Jews were forced into an area that had previously housed 3,000 people. Families were crammed into single rooms. Multiple families shared apartments designed for one. The overcrowding created conditions where disease spread rapidly, where privacy became impossible, where the basic dignity of human existence eroded daily. Natalia and her family were forced into the ghetto. Her sister Helena remained with her. They lived in cramped quarters with minimal food rations, typically receiving bread, watery soup, and occasionally potatoes. The official ration provided approximately 800 calories per day, far below what was necessary for survival. People supplemented these rations through black market purchases, through smuggling, through any means available. Many starved anyway. Typhus, tuberculosis, and other diseases killed hundreds. The psychological impact was perhaps worse than the physical deprivation. The ghetto walls were 3 meters high, designed with distinctive rounded tops that resembled Jewish headstones. This was not accidental. The Germans made their symbolism clear. This was a place of death. The Jews imprisoned inside could see the walls constantly reminding them they were marked for elimination. In June 1942, the Germans began liquidating the Krakow ghetto. They conducted selections, separating those deemed fit for labor from those who would be sent directly to death camps. Thousands were transported to Belzec extermination camp. Thousands more were shot in the streets during the deportations. The liquidation continued in waves over the following months. By March 1943, the ghetto was nearly empty. Natalia and Helena were selected for labor and sent to Plaszow, a forced labor camp on the outskirts of Krakow. The camp had been established in 1942 on the site of 2 Jewish cemeteries. The Germans forced Jewish laborers to tear up the headstones and use them for paving roads and building foundations. This desecration was deliberate, another method of psychological torture, forcing Jews to destroy their own sacred spaces. Plaszow became an official concentration camp in January 1943. By that time, it held thousands of prisoners in wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. The commandant was Amon Göth, an Austrian SS officer who had arrived in February 1943. Göth was 24 years old when he received the position. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1930 and the SS in 1932. He was a true believer in Nazi ideology, convinced of Aryan racial superiority and Jewish subhumanity. Göth's daily routine included shooting prisoners for sport. He kept a balcony at his villa overlooking the camp. In the mornings, he would appear with a high-powered rifle and shoot prisoners randomly as they walked to work assignments. Sometimes he shot them for moving too slowly. Sometimes he shot them for moving too quickly. Sometimes he shot them for no reason except that he wanted to shoot someone. Survivors estimated he personally killed at least 500 people, though the actual number was certainly higher. The camp's conditions were designed to work prisoners to death. Inmates received minimal food, typically watery soup and small portions of bread. They worked 12 to 14 hours per day in quarries, construction sites, or workshops. They slept in overcrowded barracks infested with lice and rats. Medical care was non-existent. Those who became too weak to work were shot. Into this environment, Natalia brought her identity as a pianist, though there was no piano and no possibility of performance. Music had become irrelevant in a place where survival depended on physical strength, luck, and the arbitrary decisions of guards who could kill without consequence. Her years of training, her Berlin triumph, her belief in music's transcendent power, all of it meant nothing at Plaszow. Until someone told Göth that trained musicians were among the prisoners. Then everything changed. Amon Leopold Göth was born in Vienna on December 11, 1908. He came from a middle-class family with publishing connections. His father owned a small press. His mother was devoutly Catholic. Göth received education through gymnasium, equivalent to high school, but showed no particular academic distinction. What he did show was an early attraction to nationalist politics and paramilitary organizations. He joined the Austrian Nazi Party in 1930 at age 21, when the party was still illegal in Austria. He joined the SS 2 years later. By the time he arrived at Plaszow in February 1943, Göth had already participated in operations to liquidate ghettos in Lublin and Tarnow. He understood his role with perfect clarity. He was not merely administering a labor camp, he was implementing the final solutions logistics in the Krakow district. The prisoners at Plaszow existed to be worked to death or killed outright. The timeline was irrelevant. The outcome was predetermined. His villa stood on a hill overlooking the camp. It was a requisitioned house, well appointed with furniture looted from Jewish homes throughout Krakow. The grand piano was a Bechstein, one of Germany's finest piano manufacturers. The instrument probably came from a wealthy Jewish family's drawing room. It was maintained by a camp prisoner who had been a piano tuner before the war. Göth insisted on proper tuning. He considered himself a cultured man, an aesthete who appreciated classical music, fine wine, and tailored uniforms. This self-image was not mere hypocrisy. Göth genuinely loved Wagner, Beethoven, and Chopin. He could discuss their compositions with knowledge and passion. He believed that appreciation of high culture was a marker of Aryan superiority. In his worldview, there was no contradiction between shooting Jewish prisoners in the morning and listening to Chopin in the evening. The Jews were subhuman, their elimination necessary for civilizational progress. Music was the achievement of the superior races. These were simply facts to him, as obvious as gravity. The villa contained other luxuries. Göth kept an extensive wine collection. He had fine china, crystal glassware, Persian rugs. His bedroom had a balcony with a clear view of the camp below. He kept 2 rifles there, a Karabiner 98K standard-issue Wehrmacht rifle and a scoped hunting rifle. Survivors testified that he would stand on that balcony in the morning, sometimes in his underwear, sometimes in his SS uniform, and shoot prisoners as they moved between barracks or toward work assignments. He did not shoot to maintain order or to punish specific infractions. He shot because he enjoyed it. Survivors described his shooting as sport, entertainment, the way another man might shoot targets at a range. Sometimes he would shoot at prisoners' feet to watch them dance. Sometimes he would shoot women carrying water buckets to see them spill. Sometimes he would simply aim and fire at the center mass of a prisoner walking alone. The camp doctor estimated Göth personally killed at least 500 people this way, though records were deliberately imprecise. The camp itself covered approximately 80 acres by mid-1943. It held between 6,000 and 8,000 prisoners at any given time, though the population fluctuated as new transports arrived and prisoners were killed or transferred to other camps. The prisoners were housed in wooden barracks, approximately 50 to 70 people per structure designed for 30. They slept on wooden bunks, 3 tiers high, with minimal blankets even in winter. The daily food ration consisted of approximately 200 grams of bread, usually made from sawdust and whatever grain the Germans could spare. Prisoners received watery soup once per day, typically made from potato peelings, turnips, and occasionally spoiled meat. The total caloric intake was between 700 and 1,000 calories per day. A person doing physical labor requires approximately 2,500 to 3,000 calories daily. The math was simple. Prisoners were being starved systematically. Work assignments included quarrying limestone, manufacturing goods for the Wehrmacht, and construction. Prisoners worked 12 to 14 hours per day with minimal breaks. Those who collapsed from exhaustion or malnutrition were shot or beaten to death. Those who became too weak to work were selected for transport to Auschwitz-Birkenau, which meant death in the gas chambers within hours of arrival. Into this environment, music existed only as another form of torture or occasional entertainment for the guards. Some camps had prisoner orchestras that played marches as work details left for labor sites. At Plaszow, music was less systematic, but Göth had his piano, and he wanted to hear it played properly. When he learned that professional musicians were among the prisoners, he ordered them brought to his villa. This was not mercy. This was acquisition of a resource, like requisitioning lumber or selecting prisoners for specific skilled labor. Natalia understood this when she stood before the Bechstein Grand that morning in March 1943. She was not there as an artist. She was there as a tool that might prove useful or might prove defective. If she played well, she had value. If she played poorly, she had no value. The equation was that simple. When Natalia lifted her hands from the keys after the final notes of Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor faded into silence, Amon Göth sat motionless in his chair. The cognac glass remained in his hand. His expression had not changed throughout the performance. He stared at the piano, or perhaps through it, his face unreadable. The silence lasted perhaps 10 seconds, perhaps 20. To Natalia, it felt infinite. Then Göth spoke. His voice was calm, measured. He said the performance was acceptable. He told Natalia and Helena they would return the following week to play again. He dismissed them. A guard escorted the 2 women back down the hill, through the camp gate, to their barracks. They were alive. They had been spared. The reprieve was temporary, conditional, but it was real. Natalia's immediate reaction was not relief but profound disorientation. She had played Chopin's Nocturne hundreds of times in her life. She had performed it in concert halls before audiences who appreciated the composer's genius. She had practiced it until her interpretation captured the melancholic beauty Chopin had intended. But she had never played it to save her life. The act of performance had been transformed utterly. Music had always been, in her understanding, a transcendent art form. It existed above and beyond the material circumstances of its performance. When she played Beethoven, she connected with something profound in human experience. When she played Chopin, she expressed emotions that words could not capture. The music was separate from politics, from economics, from the brutal facts of power and survival. This was what she had been taught, what she had believed, what had given her life meaning. But in Göth's villa, with his rifles visible through the balcony doorway, with his pistol resting on the side table, with the knowledge that he had shot prisoners that same morning and would shoot more tomorrow, music had become something entirely different. It had become a transaction. Her technical skill and emotional interpretation had monetary value in the camp's economy of death. She had traded a 5-minute performance of Chopin for perhaps a week of life, perhaps longer, if Göth remained pleased. This realization arrived not as an intellectual epiphany, but as a physical sensation, a kind of nausea that had nothing to do with hunger. Her fingers had executed the Nocturne's phrases with the precision of thousands of hours of practice. Her hands had moved correctly across the keys. Her foot had used the sustain pedal appropriately. She had played beautifully, and the beauty had been deployed as a survival tool, like stealing an extra piece of bread or hiding from a selection. The distinction she had always believed existed between high art and base necessity collapsed completely. Chopin's Nocturne, one of the most sublime achievements of Western classical music, had become functionally equivalent to any other resource she might barter for survival. The music had not saved her because it was transcendent. It had saved her because it pleased a murderer who happened to enjoy Chopin. Her sister Helena felt the same disorientation. Helena was not a professional pianist, but she could play adequately. Together they had been selected to live because they possessed a skill the commandant valued. If Göth had valued carpentry instead, carpenters would have been spared. If he had valued nothing, everyone died. The arbitrary nature of survival became impossible to ignore. But they were alive. That was the only fact that mattered in Plaszow. Everything else, including the psychological cost of that survival, was secondary. They returned to their barracks. They said nothing to the other prisoners about what had happened. Speaking of good fortune in a concentration camp invited resentment, or worse, it invited attention from guards who might decide to eliminate that good fortune. The following week, guards came for them again. They walked up the hill to Göth's villa. He was waiting with the same glass of cognac, the same posture, the same expectation. They played. He listened. He dismissed them. This became routine. The performances for Göth occurred irregularly over the following months, sometimes weekly, sometimes with gaps of 2 or 3 weeks. Natalia and Helena never knew when guards would appear at their barracks and order them to report to the commandant's villa. The unpredictability was part of the psychological torture. They lived in constant anticipation of the next summons, never certain whether each performance would be their last. Göth's requests followed a pattern. He favored Chopin above all other composers. The Nocturnes especially pleased him, particularly the Nocturne in C-sharp minor that Natalia had played during their first performance. He also requested Chopin's waltzes, the polonaises, and occasionally the etudes. Sometimes he requested Beethoven. Sometimes he requested lighter pieces, salon music, popular melodies that could be played from memory. The performances took place in the late afternoon or early evening. Göth would sit in his upholstered chair with his cognac. Sometimes his adjutants were present. Sometimes he was alone. He never spoke to Natalia or Helena beyond issuing instructions about what to play. He treated them as one might treat a phonograph, a mechanical device that produced desired sounds when operated correctly. After each performance, he dismissed them without comment on the quality of the playing. Silence meant adequacy. Adequacy meant survival for another interval. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Between performances, Natalia worked like every other prisoner. She was assigned to a workshop where she sewed uniforms for Wehrmacht soldiers. The work was tedious, repetitive, required manual dexterity, but no particular skill. Her hands, which had been trained for the precise and elegant movements required by Chopin's etudes, now pushed needles through coarse fabric for 12 hours each day. Her fingers developed calluses in new places. Her back ached from hunching over the workbench. She received the same starvation rations as other prisoners. She slept in the same overcrowded barracks. The only difference was that periodically she walked up the hill to play piano for the man who was methodically murdering everyone in the camp. The psychological dissonance became unbearable in moments she could not predict or control. She would be sewing a uniform jacket, her mind blank with exhaustion, and suddenly she would remember playing the opening phrases of a Chopin Nocturne the previous week. The melody would return to her, unwanted, and with it the memory of Göth sitting motionless in his chair, and behind him through the window the camp where thousands were dying. The beauty of the music and the horror of the context existed simultaneously in her mind, impossible to reconcile. Other prisoners noticed that Natalia and Helena received special treatment. The summons to the commandant's villa were public. Everyone saw the guards come for them. Everyone saw them return. Some prisoners understood and said nothing. Some resented what they perceived as privilege, but no one openly discussed it, because discussing anything in Plaszow invited danger. Information was currency, and any information could be weaponized by guards, by capos, by other prisoners desperate enough to trade information for advantage. The privilege, such as it was, consisted entirely of not being shot on any given day. Natalia and Helena received no extra food, no lighter work assignments, no better sleeping conditions. Göth's protection extended only as far as his whim lasted. If he tired of the music, if he decided he wanted to hear a different instrument, if he simply woke up one morning in a murderous mood and wanted to shoot someone, they would die like everyone else. The protection was theoretical, conditional, revocable, without notice or explanation. Natalia later described these months as a kind of death, even while she remained physically alive. The person she had been before the war, the concert pianist who believed in music's transcendent power, had been annihilated as completely as if Göth had shot her. What remained was a survival mechanism that happened to include the ability to play piano. The music had been emptied of meaning. It was technique without art, beauty without transcendence, sound without soul, and yet she played as beautifully as her malnourished body could manage. This was perhaps the cruelest irony. She could not afford to play poorly. Poor playing meant death. So she summoned whatever strength remained and played Chopin with the same attention to phrasing, dynamics, and emotional interpretation that had earned praise in Berlin. She performed as if she still believed music mattered, and in the performance, the belief became grotesquely inverted. Music mattered only because it could delay death. Art had been reduced to its most primitive function, a tool for survival, in a world where survival itself had lost all dignity. The performances for Göth continued through the spring and summer of 1943. During this period, Plaszow expanded significantly. The prisoner population grew to approximately 25,000 by mid-1944, as the Germans liquidated smaller labor camps and ghettos throughout the region. New barracks were constructed using prisoner labor. The mortality rate increased proportionally. More prisoners meant more deaths from starvation, disease, exhaustion, and execution. Göth's balcony shootings continued daily. In September 1944, as Soviet forces advanced from the east, the SS began dismantling the camp. Prisoners were evacuated in waves to other concentration camps deeper in German-held territory. The strong enough to walk were sent to Auschwitz-Birkenitz, Gross-Rosen, or Mauthausen. Those too weak to walk were shot. The Germans attempted to destroy evidence of mass murder, exhuming and burning bodies from mass graves within the campground. Natalia and Helena were among those selected for transport. They were sent to Auschwitz-Birkenitz in October 1944, arriving on the selection platform where SS doctors divided incoming prisoners into those fit for labor and those sent immediately to the gas chambers. Both sisters passed selection. They were tattooed with prisoner numbers, their heads were shaved, and they received the striped prisoner uniforms. They were assigned to a barracks in the women's camp. Auschwitz represented an intensification of everything Plaszow had been. The industrial scale of murder was immediately visible. The crematorium chimneys operated continuously. The smell of burning flesh permeated the entire camp. Selections occurred regularly, culling those who had weakened beyond usefulness. Life expectancy for prisoners not immediately gassed upon arrival was measured in weeks or months, rarely longer. But by late 1944, the German administration of the camp system was beginning to collapse under the pressure of the advancing Red Army. In November, Heinrich Himmler ordered the cessation of gassing operations at Auschwitz. The SS began evacuating prisoners westward as Soviet forces approached. In January 1945, as Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance, the SS evacuated approximately 60,000 prisoners from Auschwitz in death marches toward camps inside Germany. Natalia and Helena were among those forced to march. The prisoners walked through snow and freezing temperatures with inadequate clothing and no food. They walked for days. Those who fell were shot by SS guards accompanying the column. Those who could not keep pace were shot. Thousands died during these marches, their bodies left frozen in ditches along the roads. The sisters survived the march and were eventually transported by train to Lichtenwerden, a small subcamp in the Sudetenland region focused on textile labor. Conditions were marginally better than Auschwitz only because the camp was smaller, and the SS guards were increasingly demoralized by Germany's obvious impending defeat. The prisoners worked in textile factories producing materials for the Wehrmacht, though by this point in the war, material shortages meant production was sporadic and chaotic. On May 6, 1945, Soviet forces liberated Lichtenwerden. The German guards announced to the remaining prisoners that the war was lost and then fled before the Red Army arrived. Approximately 300 female prisoners found themselves suddenly free amid the chaos of Germany's collapse. There was gunfire in the distance. There was no food. There was no clear authority. Liberation was not a clean moment of salvation, but rather a transition from one form of uncertainty to another. Natalia and Helena walked out of the camp. They began making their way back toward Poland, toward Krakow, traversing war-torn territories where displaced persons, refugees, and former prisoners moved in all directions seeking home or family, or simply somewhere to exist. The journey took weeks. They traveled by foot, by occasional truck transport, by whatever means presented themselves. When they finally reached Krakow in late May or early June 1945, they found a city that had survived physically intact but was psychologically devastated. The Jewish community of Krakow had been annihilated. Of approximately 60,000 Jews who had lived in the city before the war, fewer than 2,000 remained. Most had been murdered at Plaszow, at Auschwitz, at other camps. Natalia's extended family was gone. Her parents were dead. Most of her friends were dead. The cafes where she had performed, the concert halls where she had played still stood physically, but the culture that had animated them had been destroyed as thoroughly as if the buildings themselves had been bombed. She returned to her family's apartment and found it occupied by strangers. This was common throughout Poland. Jewish property had been seized, redistributed, occupied. Reclaiming it was difficult, often impossible, and frequently dangerous. Anti-Jewish violence continued even after the war's end, as some Poles resented Jewish survivors returning to reclaim property or simply existing as reminders of what had happened. Natalia Karp remained in Poland for approximately 2 years after liberation. She attempted to rebuild some semblance of a life in Krakow, but the city held too many ghosts. The streets where she had walked as a child, the parks where she had played, the concert halls where she had performed, all were haunted by memories of what had been and what could never be again. Poland itself was transforming under Soviet influence into a communist state. The political situation was unstable, dangerous for anyone with Western connections or bourgeois background. In 1947, Natalia emigrated to England. She settled in London, a city filled with refugees, displaced persons, and survivors attempting to create new lives from the ruins of their old ones. London had survived the Blitz with scars, but remained structurally intact, and more importantly, it offered the possibility of anonymity. She could be simply another refugee among thousands, rather than a marked survivor in a city where everyone knew what had happened. She resumed her career as a pianist. This decision was not obvious or inevitable. Many survivors could not return to their pre-war professions, especially those professions connected to cultural life and public performance. The psychological wounds were too deep, the associations too painful, but Natalia returned to music, perhaps because it was the only identity she had left, or perhaps because not returning would have meant Goethe and the Nazis had won completely. She performed with prestigious ensembles including the London Philharmonic Orchestra and the BBC Symphony Orchestra. She gave solo recitals. She taught piano students. She practiced daily, maintaining the discipline that had defined her life since childhood. To observers, to audiences, to students, she appeared to be simply a talented pianist with an Eastern European background. She did not discuss the war. She did not discuss Plaszow. She did not discuss the performances for Goethe. This silence was typical among survivors. Many could not speak about their experiences for decades after the war. The trauma was too immediate, too overwhelming. The gap between what they had endured and what normal life required of them was unbridgeable through conversation. How could she explain to a London audience that she had played the same Chopin Nocturne they were applauding in the villa of a mass murderer? How could she explain that the beauty they heard in her interpretation was inseparable from the memory of playing to save her life? In interviews conducted decades later, Natalia described the post-war years as a period of careful compartmentalization. She could function as a pianist because she separated the act of playing from the memories attached to specific pieces. When she performed Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor, she focused on technique, on interpretation, on the musical structure itself. She did not allow herself to remember Goethe's villa. This required enormous psychological effort, a constant vigilance against intrusive memories and associations. She married and had a family, though details of her personal life remained largely private. She maintained this privacy deliberately. Survivors often struggled with the question of how much to tell their children, their spouses, their friends. Some told everything, unable to contain the memories. Others told nothing, building walls between their wartime experiences and their post-war identities. Natalia chose the second path, at least initially. But memory is not infinitely compressible. The psychological cost of performing music that had been weaponized for survival manifested in ways she could not always control. She described moments when she would be in the middle of a performance and suddenly feel herself back in Plaszow, see Goethe's face, feel the terror of knowing that a wrong note might mean death. She would continue playing, her hands executing the phrases from muscle memory, while her mind fought to remain present in the concert hall rather than sliding back into the past. In 2005, at age 94, Natalia gave an interview to David Cohen. She played Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor for him, the same piece that had saved her life 62 years earlier. Her hands, though aged, retained their skill. The interpretation remained technically proficient, emotionally nuanced. When she finished, she described how the music felt different now, how the associations had evolved over decades but never entirely disappeared. She explained that playing Chopin still carried the weight of Plaszow, but the weight had transformed. It was no longer purely traumatic. It had become something more complex, a testament to survival, to the possibility of beauty. Existing even in proximity to absolute horror, to the strange fact that music could be simultaneously a tool of survival and an expression of humanity's highest aspirations. The contradiction never resolved. She simply learned to live with it. Natalia Karp died in London on July 9, 2007, at age 96. Her obituaries described her as a Holocaust survivor and accomplished pianist. They mentioned her performances with major orchestras, her teaching career, her longevity. Some mentioned that she had played for Amon Göth at Plaszow, though the details were often vague or sanitized. The full psychological complexity of what that experience meant remained largely unexplored in public accounts of her life. Her story raises questions that have no comfortable answers. She survived because she possessed a skill that happened to align with a murderer's aesthetic preferences. Thousands of other prisoners at Plaszow possessed skills, possessed talents, possessed qualities that might have made them valuable in different contexts. They died because their particular abilities did not interest Göth, or because they never had the chance to demonstrate those abilities, or because Göth simply shot them before anyone knew what they could do. The arbitrariness is unbearable to contemplate. If Göth had preferred painting to music, painters would have lived, and Natalia would have died. If he had cared nothing for art of any kind, everyone died regardless of talent. Survival in the concentration camps depended on factors prisoners could not control: the whims of guards, the administrative needs of the camp, the luck of not being selected for execution on any particular day, the accident of possessing a skill someone in power happened to value at that moment. Natalia's musical training, her years of practice, her triumph in Berlin, none of it gave her any moral claim to survival. She did not deserve to live more than the prisoners who could not play piano. She simply had an asset that could be bartered in the camp's grotesque economy of death. This is one of the Holocaust's fundamental obscenities. It reduced human beings to their utility, and even that utility was subject to arbitrary revocation at any moment. But her story also illuminates something about art's function under extreme conditions. Music did not transcend the horror of Plaszow. It could not. The idea that art exists in some pure realm untouched by politics or violence is a luxury available only to those who have never faced existential threat. When Natalia played Chopin for Göth, the music was thoroughly contaminated by the context of its performance. The beauty of the Nocturne could not redeem or transcend the reality of the camp outside the villa's windows. Yet music still mattered, though not in the way Natalia had been taught to believe. It mattered because it could be deployed as a survival tool. It mattered because technical skill retained exchange value even in a death camp. The transcendence she had believed in was false. But the material reality of music as sound, as performance, as something that could affect another person's decisions, that remained true. This is perhaps the hardest lesson. Art is not separate from power. Beauty is not separate from violence. The same Chopin Nocturne can be performed in a Berlin concert hall and in a concentration camp commandant's villa, and it remains recognizably the same composition, but its meaning transforms utterly depending on who plays it and who listens, and what consequences follow from the performance. After the war, when Natalia returned to performing, she had to rebuild her relationship with music from this foundation. She could not reclaim the innocent belief that art transcends material reality. She knew too much, but she could recognize that music remained meaningful even after that innocence was destroyed. The meaning was different, more complicated, shot through with irony and pain, but it was real. Her continued performance of Chopin decades after liberation was an act of defiance, though not in any simple or heroic sense. She was not proving that beauty defeated evil, or that the human spirit transcended oppression or any of the other comfortable narratives people construct about Holocaust survival. She was simply asserting that she had the right to play music, without being defined entirely by the context in which she had once played to save her life. When we think about the pianist who played Chopin for the commandant, we should resist the temptation to make the story inspirational. Natalia's survival was not a triumph of art over barbarism. It was an accident of having a skill that momentarily pleased a mass murderer. But we should also resist the temptation to see her only as a victim. She made the choices available to her. She played as beautifully as her malnourished body could manage. She used the only asset she had, and she survived to play again in freedom, carrying the burden of that survival for 62 more years. The Bechstein grand piano in Goeth's villa, like the piano she played in London decades later, was just an instrument. It produced sounds based on mechanical principles. But what those sounds meant, what they accomplished, what psychological cost they exacted from the person producing them, that depended entirely on the context of power, violence, and the irreducible arbitrariness of who lived and who died. Natalia understood this better than most people ever will. She lived with that understanding until the day she died, playing Chopin with hands that remembered everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.